Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church by Reverend Mr. Kevin W. Vogel, read by Father Kevin W. Vogel. Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church, Chapter 6, Conclusion. This work sought to show, through an overview of current scientific facts and theories, the philosophical framework of the methods of science and theology, and the doctrinal teachings of the faith, the extent to which Catholic Christianity and its strictly scientific theories of evolution can be reconciled, and what questions are still to be answered. While careful distinction among the methods of empirical science, philosophy, and theology have led to the resolution of many objections to the compatibility of the science of evolution and Catholic theology, there are some aspects that will continue to cause tension. The Catholic Church has always been convinced that God is the source of all truth, so truth that comes through reason can never contradict truth that is revealed directly by God. Thus, the Church is unafraid to enter into dialogue with the natural sciences, including that of evolution. While the Church does not have any official position on evolution as a science, it has addressed questions in four main areas surrounding evolution: philosophical and theological truth, divine ordering and random processes, uniqueness of human nature, and polygenism and original sin. One can glean a number of principles from these magisterial writings. Principle 1. Science, philosophy, and theology are each legitimate methods of knowing, with their own first principles and limitations. 1.1. Science can only give partial information about man. 1.2. Philosophy can act as the wider perception which will aid in the science-theology dialogue. Principle 2. There is no opposition between a process science would understand as random and the necessary involvement of God in this same process from the point of view of theology. 2.1. Discovering whether the origin of the universe was in reason or unreason should draw upon scientific observations of the world, but is ultimately a question of philosophy and theology. 2.2. God continues his providential work of creating through secondary causes. 2.3. God's providence extends to everything that exists. Principle 3. The human person is a union of body and spiritual soul. 3.1. All things, including humans, have natures. 3.2. The human body can have some connection to previous existing living matter. 3.3. The spiritual soul requires an immediate creation by God. 3.4. Creation of the soul can be described as a non-disruptive divine intervention. 3.5. Evolution in man is fundamentally different from evolution in animals due to the ontological discontinuity of the spiritual soul. Principle 4. Original sin has the moral character of a personal sin. 4.1. Man was created good and not subject to death. 4.2. It is not apparent how polygenism can be reconciled with original sin. 4.3. Original sin is transmitted to all humans. 4.4. Original sin is not founded in reason, so can never be fully understood. When one addresses the interaction between evolutionary science and Catholic theology, one should avoid using the popular categories that indiscriminately merge religious, philosophical, and scientific conclusions. It is essential to distinguish among these three ways of knowing. Since the formal objects of empirical science and sacred theology do not overlap, philosophy, particularly metaphysics, philosophy of nature, and epistemology, is needed as a wider perception that can include aspects of both. Without philosophy, a proper relationship between empirical science and sacred theology cannot be established. When philosophy is used to understand the proper methods and limits of both science and theology, a number of objections to the compatibility of biological evolution and theology can be answered. Objections and Answers. The first set of objections that can be answered are done so in light of a proper understanding of the limits of the methods of empirical science. Objection 1. Science shows us that we can only know physical things, and that there is nothing other than that which is physical. Answer 1. Since the scientific method limits itself to considering only physical causes, methodological naturalism, science cannot make judgments about the existence of non-physical causes or judge if we can know about non-physical causes. Objection 2. Macroevolution proves that God cannot exist. Answer 2. Methodological naturalism prevents science from making judgments about the existence of non-physical causes, including God. Objection 3. Macroevolution is not scientific because its claims cannot be tested experimentally. Answer 3. The experimental method is used to explore the relationship between present and future events, while the historical method is used to explore the relationship between present and past events. Both can be considered legitimate means of knowing something, as long as one keeps in mind the limitations of the methods. The simple fact that macroevolution utilizes historical methodology more so than experimental cannot automatically exclude macroevolution from being scientific. Footnote 344. Knowing the proper method of empirical science allows one to place science in proper relationship with the methods of theology and philosophy. Several further objections, both scientific ones against philosophy and theology, as well as philosophical ones against science, can be answered. Objection 4. Biblical interpretation must be subject to the methods of science. Answer 4. As a subdivision of theology, hermeneutics cannot be subject to the methods of the physical sciences. Scientifically based methods, for example historical critical, can and should be included, but always in conjunction with the exegetical tradition of the Church. One must begin with a conviction of faith, since Scripture is the history of God revealing himself to man. Objection 5. Due to the understanding of human origins through macroevolution, the Genesis creation stories should be disregarded as myths. Answer 5. While it is true that the Bible does not teach science and that one must distinguish between the content and proper form of the writing, it is improper to reduce these stories to myth based on scientific findings alone. Such passages should be interpreted within the methodology of theology. A theology that is determined by science and its methodological naturalism fails to retain its openness to the knowledge of divine revelation by faith. Objection 6. The usefulness of modern scientific methods in gaining understanding of the world has rendered metaphysics and philosophy of nature obsolete. Answer 6. Empirical science, metaphysics, and philosophy of nature have different formal objects. Science looks at changing physical being in terms of observable properties. Philosophy of nature looks at changing physical being in terms of its inner identity, its nature or essence. And metaphysics looks at all being insofar as it is being. Simply because science takes a different approach cannot determine that the other two are invalid. Objection 7. Macroevolution proves there are no formal and final causes. Answer 7. Empirical science is limited by its method to consider only the material causes and physical efficient causes of physical changing being, methodological naturalism. Thus, evolution as a science cannot rule out the existence of formal and final causes. In fact, scientists cannot help but speak as if things had final causes. This last objection is related to a specific area of contention between empirical science and theology that occurs when speaking of chance or randomness. Much of this can be resolved with a proper understanding of how science can use chance, and by distinguishing that use from false philosophical versions. Objection 8. Macroevolution shows that the world was created by chance, so there is no design and thus no God. Answer 8. Chance, or randomness, when properly used by science, refers to the interaction of uncorrelated causal sequences. The causes involved are not easily predictable because of a multiplicity of factors. This form of chance, since it is dependent upon prior ordered causes, is open to a first cause, God. Those who claim that chance is some kind of absolute randomness go beyond science to make a philosophical claim, for it is impossible for science to deny every possible intelligible pattern through its empirical methods. To appeal to chance as a reason against God as the first cause of creation is to misunderstand the concept of chance. Objection 9. Macroevolution is false because it claims a series of events to be absolutely random, which is contrary to sound philosophical principles. Answer 9. This objection is valid, but instead of disproving evolution as a science, it disproves philosophical versions of evolution that are based on this false philosophical principle. This understanding of randomness is not an essential or proper part of evolution as a science. When chance is properly understood, one must still explain how God can act in the natural world without opposing the created order. Objection 10. Even if chance within evolution is not absolute, it would seem to deny God's continuing action in the universe. How is it that God's providence could guide an evolutionary process that empirical science attributes to chance? Answer 10. A process that is random to us is not random to God's understanding and action. Not only would God know the ordering behind evolution, but he would also will to bring about this ordering through the necessary and contingent events of changing creation. Objection 11. Divine interventions subvert natural laws and are an appeal to a God of the gaps. Answer 11. It is true that one cannot appeal to divine intervention within the methods of science in order to fill in gaps of knowledge. It is possible for God to bring about events that have no explanation in the natural order, as we know it via miracles, though scientific methods claim ignorance rather than appeal to God. Any interventions that occur by God cannot subvert nature, since God's providence is behind both natural laws and any acts that transcend created causes. Such interventions can be termed non-disruptive. Questions become even more specific when addressing issues about the origin of the human person. Objections pertain both to natures in general and to human nature with a spiritual soul. The following objections are answered based on the recognition of the methodological naturalism of empirical science, as well as a proper understanding of chance. Objection 12. Macroevolution shows there is no such thing as the human soul. Answer 12. Limited by methodological naturalism, empirical science cannot make judgments regarding the existence of the spiritual soul. Objection 13. Macroevolution, based on chance, shows that the process of change is not oriented to a purpose, so it has no final cause. If there is no cause, there can be no nature that directs the thing to its end. Therefore, natures do not exist. Answer 13. This argument fails in three ways. 1. Chance is not absolute, so cannot rule out final causes. 2. Science cannot make a judgment about the existence of final causes. And 3. Chance actually presupposes real things with real natures. Objection 14. If natures exist, they must be physical traits. Evolution shows that physical traits vary between generations, so natures based on these traits must be changing. But natures are defined philosophically as unchanging. Thus, there are no natures. Answer 14. This argument fails in at least two ways. 1. The first step assumes ontological naturalism, which cannot be scientifically argued. 2. Particular beings can have differences in characteristics while sharing the same nature. The previous three objections come from the side of science, while the next set of objections come from philosophy. Again, one must hold science to its methodological limits. The difficulty of addressing these objections require a deeper analysis using philosophy of nature. Objection 15. Evolution claims that species evolve from a lower order to a higher order without the presence of a higher cause. This is contrary to the philosophical principles of potency and act, therefore evolution is impossible. Answer 15. This objection is valid, but instead of disproving evolution as a science, it disproves philosophical versions of evolution that are based on a false philosophical understanding of chance as absolute. This understanding of randomness is not an essential or proper part of evolution as a science. Objection 16. A species determined by a unique nature cannot evolve into a new species with a new nature, since its nature orders the species to reproduce that same nature in its offspring. Also, the concept of gradual changes between species contradicts the philosophical concept of immediate substantial change. Thus, from a philosophical understanding, evolution is impossible. Answer 16. This is a legitimate objection. A substantial change must take place to bring about a new species. But the process of gradual change between species does not contradict immediate substantial change. When parental gametes combine, an immediate substantial change occurs. While the natures of the parents are ordered to reproduce the same natures in their offspring, this occurs through the natures of the instrumental causes of the gametes, which can have formal powers and potencies different, within limits, from that of the parents that produce them. The new substantial form of the offspring, which the nature of the parents ordered to be as close as possible to the form of the parents, is not a new biological species, but rather an intermediate participation in both the initial and new species. Thus, Aristotelian philosophy seems to be open to the possibility of changes between species. What science understands as a process of gradual changes is a continuum of immediate substantial changes behind the transition from one species to another. Objection 17. If new species were to arise from already existing species, the new species would necessarily be less complex, since the defects that brought about the new species would cause a loss of information. The new act cannot be greater than the potencies that were in act prior to it. Evolution requires an increase in information in order to produce more complex organisms, thus evolution cannot occur. Answer 17. It is true that for a species to evolve from a lower order to a higher order, there must be the presence of a higher cause. Since God is the principal cause behind all secondary causes, his higher causality working through the secondary causes, natures, mutations, etc., could order the matter of the previous species in such a way as to receive a substantial form of a species of higher complexity. Objection 18. The transition from pre-existing matter to a body fit for the human soul would require a direct intervention by God, not only for the soul but also for the body, since the soul is the form of the body. Therefore the body could not evolve from prior matter. Answer 18. This is a valid point. The soul is the form of a specific body, so the human body must be different in some way from a body that does not have a spiritual soul. But this need not render all connection to previous non-human bodies impossible. Understanding the transition from one species to another as a series of substantial changes would seem to be consistent with the infusion of the spiritual soul changing the disposition of the matter it receives from the gametes, since the change from the gametes to the zygote already must be a substantial one. Objection 19. It is contrary to the nature of a thing to have offspring that does not have the same nature. Therefore, a process where one species produces another is impossible. Answer 19. Everything that exists is oriented to relationship with God according to the mode of existence it has. In the process of one species evolving into another, mutated offspring that do not have the same substantial form as the parents could be at a higher level of relation with God, brought about by God as primary cause working through secondary causes. This substantial change would not be a disruption of the ordering of the prior species, but rather would allow that being to be more fully what its parents were oriented to be. This holds as well for the human soul, which would allow for an even greater relationship with God, one that is personal. The above description of macroevolution through the language of philosophy of nature may bring the following objection from the scientist. Objection 20. The above formulation of human evolution is no longer what science considers to be macroevolution. Thus, it is equivalent to denying macroevolution. Answer 20. It is true that human evolution cannot be spoken of univocally with biological evolution as described within the limits of empirical science. This is because the existence of the spiritual soul must be taken into account, something science cannot do. This is only a problem for those who improperly hold to ontological naturalism. Scientists should recognize that when cosmic and biological evolution are described, it is not done so univocally either. The final area of contention between evolution and theology is in the area of original sin and polygenism. One must hold, following Humana Generis, that it is not apparent how polygenism can be reconciled with original sin, since to do so would seem to require one to hold that there existed, quote, men who did not take their origin through natural generation from Adam, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents, end quote. Footnote 345. Polygenism thus appears to be contrary to church teaching as represented in Principles 4 and 4.3 given above. One must first address the assertion by past theologians that since it is not apparent how the Church's formulation of the doctrine of original sin can be reconciled with polygenism, one must reformulate the doctrine. There are two main answers for why the doctrine cannot be reformulated in this way. Assertion 1. Since it is not apparent how the Church's formulation of the doctrine of original sin can be reconciled with polygenism, one must reformulate the doctrine. Answer 1.1. One may not apply an evolutionary principle of everything changes to church doctrine. Doctrine may develop, but cannot be formulated in a way that is fundamentally different from previous understandings. No conclusive argument showing compatibility between original sin and polygenism can be made if one changes the meaning of original sin. Answer 1.2. The mystery of original sin occurs outside fallen time, so its formulation cannot be subject to categories, like polygenism, that presuppose the fallen condition. Original sin can only be described as the Church does through biblical typology. While these answers show why the doctrine of original sin cannot be redefined, they do not resolve the problem of reconciling original sin and polygenism. To say that original sin and the fall occur outside fallen time does not make the problem irrelevant, for once the fall takes place, the first parents would then be subject to observation in fallen time. Once in fallen time, the question of polygenism must be addressed. The problem, of course, assumes that polygenism is an observed fact. One can argue that this is not the case due to the methodological limits of science. Assertion 2. Macroevolution proves polygenism. Answer 2. Science assumes polygenism rather than proves it, both in the case of monocentrism and polycentrism. Scientific methods assume that it is more likely that a population will have more than one pair, but cannot actually determine what that size is. While polycentrism requires polygenism, monocentrism is open to the possibility of monogenism. In the case of monocentrism, which is currently the best theory, science cannot disprove the possibility of monogenism. Unlike in the past, the current state of scientific theory about human origins strongly favors monocentrism. As theories stand today, science can provide no direct evidence against the Church's vision of the beginning of man, since monocentric theories cannot directly rule out the possibility of a monogenism that seems to be needed for the biblical vision. Unresolved tension. Having seen the resolution of many objections to the compatibility of the science of evolution and Catholic theology, one must note some aspects that will continue to cause tension. First, within the proper methods of science, experimental and historical, the different versions of evolution will continue to be critiqued by scientists based on new observations. By making the distinction between evolution as a science and and forms of evolution that incorporate false philosophical presuppositions, this work has refrained from critiquing the science. This role is properly played by scientists. There will always be a certain tension as scientists critique the evolutionary theories of their peers and strive to formulate the best theoretical framework to fit the present traces of past events. Second, the question remains as how to open up those who reject philosophy and theology to the knowledge these ways of knowing can give. Insofar as philosophy, especially metaphysics, continues to be rejected as a legitimate way of knowing, Catholic teaching will remain inexplicable in light of biological evolution. Finally, questions in the area of polygenism and original sin will still persist for theologians. One must still hold, following Humanigeneris, that it is not apparent how polygenism can be reconciled with original sin. Monogenism seems to be required. Fortunately for now, the most accepted scientific theories of human origin are open to monogenism. It is likely that the tension between evolution and original sin will always remain, eluding a complete rational understanding, since evil itself is not rational. Perhaps leaving open questions will distress those who hope once and for all to solve the problems surrounding evolution and the Catholic faith. Yet one must recall from this discussion that human knowledge is limited. From what can be known, it is clear that a Catholic need not fear proclaiming the Church's vision of the good creation, fall from grace, and redemption in Christ in the presence of the modern science of evolution. Such a Catholic in no way compromises his reason, but allows reason to expand, to reclaim the areas of knowledge it can rightly know. Further, one becomes open to receiving the knowledge faith brings, one that is never contrary to reason, but builds upon and perfects reason. Potential harmony. It should be quite evident that this work has not addressed all aspects surrounding the relation of evolutionary science with Catholic theology, but focused on only 4 areas that directly affect evolution's compatibility with the Catholic faith. The Catholic must defend theological and philosophical thought, God's providential guidance of creation, the human person, and the doctrine of original sin. Yet there are other aspects which were not addressed. First, this work did not attempt to show whether or not evolution as a science actually occurred, or through what mechanisms, for this is a scientific question to be done within the methods of science. Such a task goes beyond the scope of this work of philosophy and theology. Footnote 346. Second, since this work focused on showing there is no direct conflict between evolutionary science and theology, it has not taken up the more positive aspect of their potential harmony. When the common understanding is that 2 things are intrinsically opposed, one must first show their compatibility before one can discuss the ways in which each actually build upon the other. That is why this work focuses on the former rather than the latter. Still, one can see several examples that could be developed from what has been discussed. Science itself attests to the overall design of the universe, since it presupposes the patterns and order that it seeks to describe. Also, scientists cannot help but refer to design, final causality, in some way. Evolution, in particular, is directed by its mechanisms in a certain direction. See Chapter 4 and Chapter 3. The low probability of occurrence for certain complex biological organisms, accounted for by chance by scientists, reveal in some way the design that is contained within all physical phenomena. See Chapter 4. Evolution supports the Catholic understanding that the world was not complete from the beginning. See Chapter 3. The understanding that natural processes can largely explain phenomena within the universe supports the Catholic understanding that God ordinarily works through his created secondary causes, in particular the inner realities of things. See Chapter 4. Some evolutionary theories, such as neo-selectionist theory, support a balance between chance and deterministic elements. Catholic theology also understands the balance of necessary and contingent causes in creation. See Chapter 2 and Chapter 4. Evolution and Catholic theology show a certain complementarity. For example, while evolution reveals the connection between humans and the natural world, theology not only agrees but also points out man's even greater difference from the rest of creation. See Chapter 3. Since natural discontinuities are found within the process of evolution, for example in neo-selectionist theory, one should not be surprised to find other discontinuities, such as the ontological discontinuity from non-human to humans. See Chapter 2 and Chapter 5. Scientists are unable to pinpoint the transition from non-humans to humans, a fact which would be consistent with the Catholic understanding of an ontological discontinuity. See Chapter 2 and Chapter 5. The current best theory about human origins, monocentrism, is open to the monogenism that Catholic theology appears to require. See Chapter 5. To address the specifics on how Catholic sacred theology is supported by observations from evolutionary science would take another complete work. One must remember, though, that any support empirical science would seem to give theology should not be considered as proof for the theological conclusions. One should never make the truths of the Catholic faith appear to be dependent upon the findings of empirical science. Those who use the findings of empirical science to determine theological truths apart from, or worse, in opposition to, divine revelation, employ improper theological methodology. The above examples could provide places where the critical openness and dynamic interchange between science and theology spoken of by John Paul II can take place. Recall the three virtues required for the study of science, philosophy, and theology: research, humility, and optimism. When any one of these three virtues are lacking, the dialogue between science and theology falters. Insufficient research can lead to the creation of a false unity. Lack of humility can cause one to refuse to recognize the limitations of one's field of study. Without optimism, one can fall into the defensive mode of fideism, either rejecting important truths in science and philosophy, or thinking faith is too weak to handle questions science poses. Future individuals involved in the discussion between evolution and faith must be formed by these virtues. Only in the presence of these three virtues can the dialogue among the three disciplines of science, philosophy, and theology be balanced and fruitful. At the conclusion of Fides et Ratio, John Paul II compares philosophy to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Quote, "Just as in giving her assent to Gabriel's word, Mary lost nothing of her true humanity and freedom, so too when philosophy, or empirical science, heeds the summons of the gospel's truth, its autonomy is in no way impaired." End quote. The Pope recalls the practice of early monks who considered Mary to be, quote, "the table at which faith sits in thought." End quote. Footnote 347. There is no better place for the scientist, the philosopher, and the theologian to sit as they ponder the truths of our changing world in light of the unchanging Redeemer, Jesus Christ. End of Chapter 6. End of Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church by Reverend Mr. Kevin W. Vogel. Read by Father Kevin W. Vogel.